I think we can get started. Marco, do
can
you
we can we start? Yeah, we can start. Okay, fantastic.
While people are joining, yeah.
Okay, they will just jump in.
Yeah. So welcome all to episode 4 of the Coping with the COVID-19 webinar series for young entrepreneurs. Today, we're going to talk about the trade in times of crisis, opportunities and solutions through digital. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. So first, please mute your microphone. Unless you want, we can, if you want to ask questions, but then you can also ask questions through the chat box. And then also feel free to turn on your camera. Like I said, we love to see your faces, but also, and then we can use the chat box for any change of information or anything you want to say throughout the session. And then lastly, we're going to report this webinar and then share the link on YouTube afterwards so that more people can watch and learn afterwards, including the ones who cannot make it today. So without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague, Marco, who's gonna be the moderator for today's webinar. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Yang. So hi, everybody. I hope you're all fine and safe. So my name is Marco Letti and I work for ITC, the International Trade Center. As you might already know, ITC is the joint agency of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, with the goal of supporting small and medium-sized enterprises from developing countries to become more internationally competitive. Today's webinar is run by the Youth and Trade Program, an ITC initiative fully dedicated to support young entrepreneurs like you with multiple technical assistance and financing solutions. Today, we will have an experienced professional from the finance industry who will guide us in understanding more about the current and future trends of trade finance. Hi, Bhavna, how are you?
Hi, I'm fabulous. I can't wait to get started. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So for whom of you that does not know our guest yet, Bhavna is a head of trade product at Lloyd's banking group in the UK and leads a team of banking professionals that drive the development of trade solutions that meet the domestic and international working capital needs of companies. Their combined efforts are directed towards ensuring that they deliver the best user experience and future-proof capabilities in order to stay relevant to clients in a rapidly changing environment. As Bhavna looks to the future, she's excited to see how the banking industry, especially trade, will respond to and embrace technology as an enabler of improved, frictionless, and sustainable outcomes for companies that trade globally. She says, if the current crisis has taught us anything, it is that we must seek digital-first strategies to ensure business continuity for clients we serve. We look forward to hearing your presentation, Bhavna. Before giving you the stage, let me explain how this webinar is going to work. So during Bhavna's presentation, we will launch a few polls to learn more about our audience, their challenges, and their expectations. Each poll will last 30 seconds and will help us adjusting the presentation flow according to your interest. So please be faster in answering each question. At the end of the presentation, my colleague Yang will collect a selection of questions for Bhavna that you will be able to submit through the chat box. Don't be shy. The whole webinar will last 15 minutes, 1 hour. So let's now begin with the first poll question. Have you secured trade finance from a bank? Have you ever secured trade finance from a bank? So answer 1, yes. The second one is no, but I've applied. The third one, no, but I believe digitization of banks will allow me to get access. And the last one, no, banks will never change. So you have a few seconds to submit your answer, so please go ahead.
I'm really curious to know the ones who answered as no, the banks won't change. I think.
Okay.
Oh wow.
Okay, that's an interesting one. So I see that many of you have never got access to trade finance, and you actually believe a lot in digitalization of banks. So I'm sure you're gonna like the presentation. Almost half of you answered that they believe in the digitization of banks to get access to finance. So this is a good input for Bhavna.
Absolutely.
So let me open this webinar by say a few things about trade finance. As you might already know, trade finance is a set of financial instruments and solutions which aims at facilitating both domestic and international trade transactions that without them would be much more challenging. So let's think about an agribusiness that wants to export and requires pre-shipment finance to pay its farmers and process its products. This is usually covered by trade finance. Or a business which ships its products internationally and wants to reduce the risk that its final buyers will not pay at the delivery. Again, this business would probably rely on a trade finance solution. Trade finance is incredibly useful for businesses, but according to a recent study conducted by the Asian Development Bank together with ITC, there is an annual global unmet demand for trade finance worth $1.5 trillion. This gap impacts particularly small businesses in developing countries and particularly women-owned and or led companies. In recent years, we have seen big innovations coming up, particularly in the digital space. Some of them are very promising and aims at reducing this gap. So it seems like there is a huge market opportunity. Bhavna, I leave you to guide us in this trade finance world. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. I think firstly, I want to say good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's joined the session. A little bit about myself in terms of, why I decided to be part of all of you today. As you know, I've had a very long banking career, and I am intellectually curious, but the bit that I loved the most about my banking career was when I was looking to build something, whether it was building something from ground zero or whether it was just taking it to the next level. And I think the bit that I love about building is, that you're creating something on it. And that's the reason why I feel like, I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So when this opportunity was given to me, I was thinking like, wow, this is a match made in heaven. The thing I love the most, I'm going to get a chance to be in your midst. And I have a huge respect for all of you, who are young and trying to pursue their dreams, etc. So I want to wish you on the onset of this session the very best for all the businesses and that you're looking to set up, and hopefully you're going to pick up some useful tools during the session. I'm really looking forward for a lot of questions as we go along or towards the end of the session. So I would say stay tuned. Okay. So Marco kind of talked a little bit about this sort of trade finance gap that is existing in the world, but also the entire world has gone through very unprecedented times. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about the impact it has had on trade globally, and then I want to kind of bring it more closer to what does it mean for Africa as a continent. So I think even before we went into the COVID-19 crisis, we already saw that there were tensions between US and China, the trade war that is going on. And, both those geographies and economies are like so important for global trade. China is the biggest factory for the globe, huge amount of exports and equally very large amount of imports. So it's really critical and at the heart of that global supply chain. US is the biggest consumer, on the planet. So, when two giants like that clash, it does impact, everybody else in the globe. But then we had this pandemic, and what it took away from all of us is the ability to move around freely as we normally do. And this crisis is a lot different from what we had in 2008 and 9, the financial crisis, because it took away some of the other liberties of movement, etc., which we had at that time. And that is what created a real problem for governments, for people and companies to kind of keep their supply chain and their businesses moving. I mean, this is no news, I'm sure, to all of you, that trade is heart of everything that is going around. Trade drives the global GDP. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I asked the question, what do you think will happen if trade is not there, right? And somebody responded, all hell will break loose, right? It is so critical in terms of making sure that the goods and services flow between companies, between countries, and really provide a impetus, real impetus to the economies of those respective countries. So with the crisis coming to fore, what we see is support from a lot of world organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, really pumping in liquidity into the system to make sure that the world doesn't come to a grinding halt. And their specific interest is more towards developing countries, because more of the developed countries have some sort of an infrastructure already in place that they can leverage, but their attention and their desire to make sure that the liquidity goes towards helping the developing countries. In this case, today's session, a lot of countries in Africa, and we're going to talk a little bit later in terms of the various government impetus that are taking place. But the reality of the matter still remains that as we come out of the crisis, the growth and the rebound is going to be slow. We will take a long time to really get into the pre-COVID state. So what we need to do as organizations and companies and people who are looking to start their own sort of business journeys is to say, what are the things we need to do differently? What has the crisis taught us that we can take from this? So I'm going to take a quote from Paul Romer. He is a Stanford economist, and he talked about the crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think I have repeatedly in my career, taken crisis as a challenge, because it always provides an opportunity for us to kind of look at how can we do things differently. So from a trade perspective, right? I mean, trade traditionally is really a lot of paper moving from A to B, right? And when I say a lot of paper, I mean, whether it is letters of credit that are being used, issuance of instruments. So stay on the previous page. Thank you, Claire. So when you talk about trade, you talk about trade instruments, which have predominantly still been very paper based. You issue a letter of credit, you issue guarantees to help you provide risk mitigation, or be it just shipping documents that you want to send overseas to your counterparty. So very, very paper-based business today, in spite of being around for donkeys of years, right? So I think one of the things that happened during COVID was then suddenly people are not in offices. So what's going to happen? Who's going to move that paper? How are the documents going to go from one country into the other, with logistics coming to a halt, with all the lockdowns taking place? So it really provided a impetus for the banks very quickly needing to move from paper to digital solutions. And the beauty of digital solutions is that you don't need somebody to move the paper. It doesn't need to go from one desk to the other. It's stored in a machine, and multiple people can see the same information at the same time, and information can flow from computer to computer in an instantaneous manner. So it kind of helps bring down the execution time of the transaction. It provides visibility, it provides transparency, which is so critical, especially as we know that companies like to trade globally. They don't want to stay in their own country and trade internally. So to help companies have aspirations to trade globally, you have to create the digital solution. But the digital solutions themselves are not enough, because a lot of these things are based on certain policies, certain uniform rules of practice. So there has to be that change to take place around the policy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what is happening on there. Then the next point I want to talk about is about building the resilient supply chains. And this is, again, important, because when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about, the buying and selling of goods and services. And till today, either companies have not paid attention to the supply chains that they have. They don't have the visibility into the various tiers of supply chain that they have, or they simply have a linear supply chain, which is, I buy from the person I can see in front of my eyes, and that's it. And moving from, those linear supply chains to digital supply chains and networks is something that, we want to talk about. So I think, sorry, Claire, stay on the same page. Yeah, I'll give you a cue when to go to the next one. And then really leveraging some of the government schemes. So, whilst all this COVID was happening, what are the governments going to do about it? Because it's really going to really impact the economy that, of a country. So in UK, for example, where I'm from, we see a lot of government schemes coming, and really most of them were targeted at the small and medium-sized companies, because they are the ones which are the most vulnerable. And I know, and I'm going to talk a little bit about so many similar, government schemes and sort of tax provisions, subsidies that are also happening in Africa, which you can leverage. And then there was this whole thing about moving on to online channels, using of social media, online marketing, e-commerce channels, etc. So again, lifting your businesses from the physical presence to more online presence, etc. And a lot of people in the audience may say, well, you know what, when you talk about online presence, you talk about social media, it assumes that everybody has access to internet, or everybody has access to broadband to have internet. I can totally appreciate that that might not be case in many of the countries or many of the places where these companies could be located. And there are certain ways and remedies that we can use to kind of help counter that. So with that, we'll now move to the next slide. Okay, so there are three things that I want to kind of cover in today's session, right? Because digitization is a really broad topic. There are a lot of things happening, but I want to kind of only talk about three things for our session today. I'm going to talk a little bit about digitization of trade. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail on supply chain finance and the supply chain networks. And third, I want to talk about, this help from the government on there, and really focus on thoughts, because I think these are the three fundamental things that are critical in terms of how we navigate our businesses from the current crisis to the future. So on digitization of trade, right? The most of the people think about this to say, oh, I want to do digitization because I want to save my back office staff. I want to do this for efficiency. I want to save it as cost. And I think if this crisis has taught us anything, it is that digitization is no longer a cost and efficiency project. It's really, really important and a must for business continuity. Businesses will find it very difficult to survive, if they're not on that digital journey on it, because you can no longer rely on the physical presence alone for your businesses. The second point is about channels of choice, right? Again, how do we deal with the banks? What kind of connectivity we could use? What kind of networks that are available there? Having that ability to say, I want to choose my channel of choice, whatever makes sense for us. And I know for a lot of you who are still micro SMEs and entrepreneurs, some of this may be, sometime distant in future, but these are the things that you will need to start thinking about now so that you can bring some of these tools in the future into your sort of business and operating model on this. Marco talked about, the trade finance, the instruments. I mentioned a few names. I talked about letters of credit. I talked about documentary collections. I talked about guarantees. Again, still a lot of paper. How can we digitize and provide electronic copies and scans of that? And some of the things that we are doing within our sort of institution is to say, the moment we receive any paper, either we will receive them in scan format and we would check the documents in scans, etc. We will no longer be getting wet signature documents. We will use e-signature and use modern technologies like optical character recognition to be able to smooth the journey of those documents as they flow from the client into the bank and onwards to wherever they need to their destination, be it the counterparty of our client where the documents need to arrive, or the counterparty's bank where we need to send. So we have a lot of technology firms and fintech companies. I know the few I have mentioned here on the slide, are have solutions that enable those technologies. Then we have converting that paper into digital originals to make sure that we preserve the authenticity and really drive transparency, because the whole idea of digitization has to be that everybody can see the information seamlessly, and same bit of information across the chain, across the supply chain. There is no delay in it, and there is authenticity associated with it on there, so you can't tamper with it. So we have partnerships with companies like Enigio, Comgo, Contour, Marco Polo, TradeShift. All are trying to bring some of those elements of that are so critical, addressing some of the pain points you have in the supply chain. And then once you have all this, how do you drive artificial intelligence? Because there's one thing about having data, but then it's about how do you synthesize that data, and you can overlay that information through artificial intelligence and drive better and swifter decision making. And a lot of, like I said to you before, none of this is going to be possible if we don't see support from industry bodies like ICC, like BAFT, like IDFA, and they are working together. And I think one of the beauties of this sort of crisis has been that we see all the industry bodies really concentrating, aggregating their efforts and joining hands to mobilize government organizations, WTO, and the respective governments to make the policy change and recognize electronic documents, electronic signature, etc. So I think I would say is that if a lot of you are thinking how does that relate to me, I would say is that you need to keep in mind that banks are making all these changes at their end. So how can you when you are engaging with the bank either ask for that, provide that feedback to the banks that is your chosen channel of choice, that you want to work digitally with the bank, so to make sure that you're not at the mercy of paper-based processes, and the banks will take those insights back and make sure they equip themselves to be able to serve your needs, and start bringing some of this sort of intel and sort of changes in your businesses to be able to do that.
So I think it's time now for the second poll question, Claire. So this question is about how is COVID forcing your business's transition to a digital model? First answer is yes. Second, I was already using a digital model. Third, no. And fourth, I don't know. You have a few seconds to give us an answer. But as you can see, businesses are moving towards digital models and banks step by step as well. And particularly trade finance has been historically paper-based. Oh, already the answer, fantastic.
Oh, wow.
So yes.
Wow, that is amazing. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point, right? And then I think I'm so delighted to see that 2/3 of the people are already pivoting to a digital model. And you know, to me, like, you don't need me on this session. You guys are already on the journey. So, you know, kudos and bravo for you know, already being agile and doing that already. So thank you so much. That is fantastic. So I want to move now on to the digital supply chain side of things. And I think I mentioned earlier that, you know, China is the factory, a global sort of factory for the globe. But you know what? One of the things that this crisis has done is really brought to light the possibility for companies to kind of seek alternative suppliers. I want to give you a quick, and I've got a case study that I will discuss towards at the end of the presentation to really bring this to life. But one of the things that I would say is that, you know, don't look at your supply chain in a linear manner, right? The person you talk to, that's not the end and start and the end of your supply chain. Try to understand that, you know, your supplier, who do they buy the goods from? And try to understand what are the different layers of supplies and customers do you have in there, and think of it like a network, as this particular you know, picture tells you. Because once you think of it as a network, then it will provide you an agility and flexibility to be able to pull necessary levers. So supplier A cannot function or provide you certain goods in a timely manner. If you knew who they buy it from, you know, there's a possibility that you could just go and reach out to them directly. I think one of the other things that has happened is that on supply chain side is that with China's factories kind of closing out and them not being functional, a lot of companies are seeking, you know, alternative suppliers, alternative countries to be able to source goods. I think for Africa, I mean, the beauty is that, you know, Europe is a lot more closer to you. So there is an opportunity right there for you to be able to seek, you know, supply chains or counterparties, you know, much closer to home. And I think let's not forget that, you know, there are a lot of onshoring of supply chains that can take place. So things that we were you know, going out to sort of low-cost centers and far-off geographies to source or sell, you know, there could be an opportunity to us to repatriate and onshore a lot of that supply and demand. And I want to give you a very interesting example here. I recently read a case study about on supply chain about, I'm sure all of you know about the Wimbledon tennis tournament that takes place in England. And the article was about the journey of a Wimbledon tennis ball. You know, how does the Wimbledon tennis ball land in London? And it actually takes 50,000 miles of sort of supply chain journey going all the way around the world, China, back and forth before it lands in Wimbledon. And when there is an opportunity and suppliers very much in England, in UK, who can actually produce those Wimbledon tennis balls. So, you know, when you think about COVID crisis, you know, and even this is an example of a tennis ball, but even for PPE, the protective personal equipment, you know, UK was going around, you know, the globe, you know, asking, you know, to Turkey, to China to get this PPE equipment, when there were companies onshore in UK who could be repurposed to be able to produce the same equipment and gear. So I think the point I'm making here is to say is that let's not undermine the possibility and the opportunity Africa has to be able to, you know, repatriate some of these supply chains back on the continent and onshore, you know, what you can. But equally, like, you know, you have an opportunity to kind of seek out, you know, new counterparties, new geographies, etc., around supply chain. And I think the use of e-commerce, right, and it's so important, right? There is a company, who would sell their goods through physical shops. Don't be shy. I would say get out there and use, e-commerce channels like Amazon, like eBay, and market, yourself more on online, sort of through social media, or Google, etc. as well. So I think you need to almost make sure that as part of your planning, there is a digital strategy as you go and work through each element of your business. But I think it's a great opportunity. This has been a blessing in disguise, and is going to make businesses pivot to a sort of more agile, more digital, and more diversified supply chains, which I think are the only way you will be able, or any business will be able to sustain their supply chain going forward. At the bottom of this slide, there's a little link, which is a really good article that was done by Deloitte. So when you have time, I would say, read that, because I think it again provides some useful tools into, why we should be thinking about the supply chains in that manner. Okay, so let's move on to the next one.
So I think we have a third question.
Oh.
Talking about e-commerce channels.
Okay.
Claire, we would like to know from you if you're using any of the following e-commerce channels. We list down some of the most used ones: Amazon, Alibaba, Jumia, eBay, Takealot, Argos, Rakuten. Can you please give us your opinion? Which one is the most used by your companies? You have a few questions. You have a few seconds. Okay, so we see that Amazon, Alibaba, Jumia, they're all really well used. Many others are definitely not used, but I'm also surprised to see others. I would be curious to know which other e-commerce channels are you guys using? Bhavna, back to you.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide then. Thank you so much for that. And again, like I said, whilst we are doing this, what is the role that governments can play? Because remember, all things that we are talking about cannot come to fruition, cannot happen if the governments also don't join hands with the bank and the companies to really bring about that change. And why should governments do that? Because trade is so important to help and support that recovery process, because it allows people to kind of, trade. There is exchange of goods and services. There is money coming in and going out, and that is what economy is all about. So, it is almost pivotal that, trade, is in the forefront of a lot of efforts that governments are having. In case of Africa, right, we know, for example, in Ethiopia, the government reduced the port tariffs by 82%, right? And that's a huge sort of allowance or sort of benefit that the Ethiopian government did. In Rwanda, IMF, enabled about $109 million of stimulus package. And again, very specific. It was geared to enable a rapid credit facility, some quick liquidity solution to the small and medium-sized companies with no conditionality or very limited conditionality. Because one of the things about the government schemes has been that, there are schemes, but how do people get access to them? And that's a big pain point. And so, it's really important that, that the schemes are not just named and announced. Governments and banks make sure that we make access to them, to the SMEs, as frictionless and as easy as possible. There have been monetary policy changes to, enabling contactless payments, right? I saw a lot of pictures on the TV whereby, all payments went from physical cash to contactless, right? And I think, it's like, having a digital wallet and walking around. And I think it's a great improvement and to be able to do. And that happened because, people were not able to get out of their homes or not able to, use hands to exchange cash. Similar, I would say schemes from Tunisia, Nigerian government, tax reforms, VAT reductions, a lot of loan extensions being given. So a lot of governments are doing a lot of things. It's really important that, companies make effort to reach out either through the websites to get information. What are the allowances, the government schemes are happening? Reach out to Ministry of Finance to say, what does it mean for your business? Reach out to export, departments in the governments to see, what are the schemes and help that those departments can provide. I want to kind of mention about one particular loan that happened in UK. It was called the Bounce Back Loan, right? And there were a lot of things, and I think there were about 4 or 5 schemes that the government in UK launched. But the reason I want to talk about the Bounce Back Loan, because that was the only loan that was digitally enabled, right? It was literally a website. People just went into it, input an amount, and if it met a certain criteria, it was approved. And it was the one that had the maximum uptake and was oversubscribed within the few hours of launching. So I think the point I'm making here by actually putting a spotlight on this particular loan is because it just proves that if you make things easy, accessible, and digitally enabled, that is what is really needed. And that's the right way to go about it and adds value to companies. There are a lot of other schemes that are also there, but still going through the usual banking rails, which, are bureaucratic, to a certain extent still, etc. So I think, again, impressing upon the point that, digital solutions are the only way to go around this. And you will see a lot of policy change taking place, enabling and making sure that happens. I'll move on to the next slide to bring some of what we have been talking about to life, right? So we talked a bit about, digitization, we talked about supply chain, and we talked about the government schemes. And I wanted to talk to you through this case study. This is a real life example. This is a real case. It's a UK company that has a business of outdoor gear. So, like helmets, gears, walking sticks, when you go for mountaineering equipment, etc. So they buy a lot of stuff from China, and then they distribute that in UK and Europe. So when this happened in the pre-COVID state, they were buying for China, was their biggest sort of supplier base. And they were selling their equipment through shops, like physical shops on high street, on there where you go into a shop and you buy this equipment. They had a facility with the bank, a small facility that they were able to have based on their own credit standing. So when the COVID thing happened, a few things happened, right? That supply from China got blocked. It didn't happen. And China was a little bit ahead of the rest of the countries on the globe. So that's where the impact was felt the most. And what happened was all the shops got closed in UK. So they couldn't really push the merchandise. There was no money coming back and no cash flow coming back. So the company came to a real grinding halt. And then they still had the fixed costs of paying the staff, paying for the rent, paying for the maintenance of their office, etc. So, it really created a lot of anxiety and sort of pain point for the company. So what we did in the bank was that we kind of talked to the company and told them to leverage some of their other supply centers, which were beyond China, other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, like India, and also some of their supplier bases in Europe. And of course, the trade-off that you have to take when you're doing that is that you know, it's no longer about, you know, what is the cheapest place where I can get something. It's all about, you know, where can I get something from, right? So you have to do trade-off on the price that, you know, you would have to pay for getting those supplies. And they were able to build an online presence very quickly and shift a lot of their goods and inventory through the online and e-shops for their business. And from a bank perspective, you know, we were able to leverage some of the government schemes to add additional liquidity to the already existing bank financing, allowing them to really tide this very difficult time. So I think this is happening real. I'm sure this is one company, and I'm sure I hope some of you can relate to this, because this is a very common problem on cash flow within every company, very much at the heart of working capital in every company. So hopefully, you know, you can relate to it and take some insights on there. I think I want to kind of close the session now with some final thoughts on this before I take any questions, to say that, you know, this is a real opportunity for us, you know, on the globe, for companies, for banks, for governments, to really reset our principles in terms of how we conduct our business, to make sure, you know, that we're able to have a business continuity. We have to be flexible to adapt to operating models to maximize opportunities, and really sort of build on resilient supply chains and counterparties and commercial relationships that are there for the long term, and engage you know, an ecosystem of companies. So no longer linear relationships, really understand the ecosystem that, you know, companies and you all function under, so that you can lean on those ecosystems and the networks to be able to help navigate your business beyond this time, and hopefully to brighter futures for your company. I think before I pass the call and session back to Marco for any questions, I want to just mention that as part of this presentation, which we're now going to go into, I have put in the appendix some helpful insights and tools on how to manage your company within the crisis. So, you know, feel free to go through it, you know, when you have time. We're not going to cover it here, but, you know, it provides, you know, some useful, you know, things that you will need to think about as you navigate your companies beyond COVID. So thank you for listening, and I really look forward to hearing some questions. Marco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bhavna. Before opening to questions, I think we have a very last poll that is about your expectations about the future. How is your outlook for the next 6-12 months when it comes to your business? Give us a bit about what's your feeling, what's your expectation about the next year future? Okay, so I'm very happy to see that most of you are optimistic about the future. That's in the heart of being an entrepreneur. So I'm very happy with this. And and now I leave it to my colleague Yang to deal with the questions. I saw several coming up in the chat box, so I'm sure we will have a good 10-15 minutes of Q&A. Thank you very much. Yang, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. And we've got several questions coming in the chat box, but also a few from the registration. So the first question is on supply chain. I think, Bhavna, you already touched upon that when you explained your case study. So the question is, are we going to see a change in supply chain across the world, especially in Africa? I mean, given the situation now is we see countries try to become less dependent on China, and what could this evolution look like?
Yeah, great question. Firstly, can I just say to you, just in answer to the last poll, this is the spirit of entrepreneurs, and it is the entrepreneurs that are keeping this whole global economy moving. So don't let that spirit die. You know, crises are going to be there. This is not the end of it. So I really want you to keep your spirit going on this, you know, and be positive for the future on there. But to answer your question, Yang, specifically, like I said, this is an opportunity. And the way I would like people to and companies to think about it is to say, you know, there's a lot of money that is being pumped into Africa right now by IMF, WTO, and a lot of organizations. One of the things that, you know, as a continent or at a country level you have to do is that, is there an opportunity for you to onshore some of those supply chain? Can you do some of those? Can you build that infrastructure in Africa, right? So you should use the money that is being put into the economies to kind of really sustain your economy for the future, right? Why should you be going all the way to Far East, which costs money, right? To kind of bring it back all in. You know, is there an opportunity for you to kind of onshore some of those supply chains? And, you know, if you can go to Asia, is there an opportunity to go to some of the low-cost centers like Poland, like Central Eastern Europe, to kind of, you know, go and source from there, you know, closer into Europe. So I absolutely believe that, you know, the supply chains are going to definitely get remodeled, but I would also feel, you know, it will be more of an ecosystem and a network, you know, where you will have the visibility to multiple layers of your supply chain so that you can just, you know, plug and play with what it is. But I really strongly encourage you to not just keep looking at China, because that cannot be the solution to all the problems, right? There's a lot of other companies who are equally good. Sometimes, you know, one of the things I heard one of the companies say to me, that for all these so many years, we have been looking for trying to squeeze out the last penny from our cost, right? And that all that strategy actually failed when COVID happened. So sometimes it make sense to pay a little bit more, but have the, I would say, comfort and surety of being able to access your supply chain more quickly than, you know, waiting for it to travel, you know, thousands of miles across the world, is what I would say. You know, you hear about Trump talking about nationalism, right? You know, you hear about Indian Prime Minister Modi talking about make it in India, make in India. I would say, you know, you should be having a slogan going out there, made in Africa, right? So, you know, use that money intelligently and create an onshore supply chains if possible.
Thanks. Maybe also made in India, because we got the next question coming from an Indian participant. Apita, I saw your lovely face. I see over there. So I'm going to ask the question on behalf of you. So she's asking, how can you relate poverty and digitalization of trade? Meaning, still there are many areas where we get to see illiteracy, lack of education, low network coverage, no ideas of technology. So how come those people can establish and manage themselves after the lockdown? But also we got BBIC Technology Corporation. Same question, more focused on African context.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? So I was thinking about it, and you know, we discussed this, that, you know, there are a lot of tools available, but it's all about, you know, what does it really mean for a micro SME? You know, how can, if somebody cannot have a broadband, how can they get internet and things like that, right? So I would say is that, you know, if it's a question about literacy and education, which is really key, because if you don't know what you need to ask, you don't know where to go, right? So I would say there are a lot of nonprofit organizations, and you have to make an effort to understand within the state you're in and the country you're in, you know, what are those nonprofit organizations that are engaged in kind of bringing about, you know, education and awareness around, you know, establishing, you know, your own businesses. So I think you need to really extend your network. There's a lot of information available on social media. There's a lot of LinkedIn is also a very important network. I've seen a lot of information available on it, but it would definitely need a little bit more work of reaching out, you know. And if you don't have access to that, I would say go and talk to people in your country who are in similar business, right? Or doing something similar, because sometimes you learn a lot through word of mouth, right? You talk to each other. So you need to really start building out a network of people who are going to be helpful and conducive to your own business goal. And that will help you, you know, get educated, raise awareness in terms of what you need to do, you know, within the context of what you're looking to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, she said yes.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So the next question is from Ozal from Pakistan. Ask a similar question on the supply chain. So he's saying, will the world move towards a localized or hyper-localized trade model after COVID-19, since the supply chain supporting global models have really suffered in the current pandemic?
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, similar to the question and answer I gave before and during my presentation, I think there isn't a right answer for supply chain, right? In the sense, like, I can't say to you, okay, before it was China, now it needs to be, everything needs to be in your own country, right? The point I want to make to you is that you need to understand, you know, what is the business you're in, what are the sourcing options you have, and actually diversify it, right? You know, there would be some suppliers that you would want to engage from a cost perspective, because they're more interesting from a, they can provide you a better unit price. But there could be other suppliers, you know, who you want to make sure you can lean on, you know, if the other suppliers are not somehow able to send on the necessary goods over to you. So you need to think about your supply chain more in terms of, you know, creating resilience, right? Creating that, what's the word? The certainty to say, you know, if one fails, can somebody else pick up the ball and run with it, right? Because you want, your purpose and your goal in your business is to keep your business moving, right? So you need to have multiple suppliers providing the same goods if possible, you know, a combination of, you know, far off, close by suppliers, right? So you need to really have like I said, an agile, diversified supply chain that you can plug and play depending on where we are, what situation we are in, and you know what it is. Because I think just sticking to what we know or having just a linear supply chain is not something that's going to be sustainable for the future.
And also we got another question from Ichit Nepal. Sorry for the pronunciation. So it's asking how, as an entrepreneur, I can look for international market as Europe or USA. So considering Nepal is a very small economy.
Yes. Can I just say something? I think I forgot to mention this. I have been an entrepreneur for a very short period of time. I was a founder of a startup that I was running, and I managed to take that startup to seed 3 funding. So I didn't quite get it up and running, but I definitely, you know, had the honor and the privilege of having a startup and having an idea to start. So I totally understand, you know, when you know you are in that journey, you know, access to information, access to right contact is, you know, is comes at a premium. So I would say that if you're looking for US and Europe, I would definitely say go into the websites, the respective government websites. So there's a lot of information available on gov.uk, for example. You have access to a lot of companies that would be in your respective industry and sector. And similarly, there are websites and government websites that you can pick information of companies that you know you in the industry that you are in. So I would say definitely that use that as a starting point. If you have a bank that if you have a banking relationship, you can absolutely reach out to your banks who would have information in those geographies or countries that you're interested in. You can also go to your own export ministry, and because they have got programs with a lot of countries, so they can tell you in terms of, and give you useful insights in terms of, countries that you're interested in, what are the tax regimes, what is required to set up a business, etc. So there are a lot of avenues that you can use to take your businesses overseas. And like I said, whilst you're doing this, don't underestimate the power of technology and social media. You no longer need anybody. You can actually raise brand awareness yourself by being on social media, by being on e-commerce channels like Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, etc. So why spend all that time in trying to moving around and trying to get information from people when you can actually somehow also, so it's a get it from kind of raise awareness and get information about companies who are in similar business as yourself through channels. So it's a mix of both is what I would say.
Okay, great. So maybe the last question is actually from the registration. It's like how to build trust and confidence in online transfer. I mean, maybe briefly, because we are talking about digital transfer, digital payment, also like logistics, cross-border delivery, things like that. So how we can better build the trust and confidence?
Well, you have to use the right websites. You need to make sure there's a right security around it. If possible, if you can use banking channels, they will make sure, right, that trust element is preserved. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you use the right channels and more secure channels to be able to do it. I have been hacked, or I would say, I've had viruses on my piece because I clicked on something that was not a safe website. So I would just say, use your normal due diligence and be aware about the websites and how the channels you use, and make sure they are trustworthy. And go if you want to do business and trade, go to your bank as a first thing, right? They will put you on the right track. And at least provide you some helpful advice.
Okay, so just before we close, Salah, is that you who raised your hand? Do you have a specific question? You can unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I have a question. My name is Victor. I'm connecting from Nigeria. So my first question is around supply chain in terms of how we need to digitalize the supply chain industry. As we're trying to do that currently in Nigeria, there are a few challenges. Number one is in the area of cost. The cost of logistics around here is on the high side. If you need to move items from one place to another, sometimes you charge $5 to $10 or something for movement of items alone, and most of them are they are not as heavy as that. Now, if you as a businessman, you need to add this cost to your sales, to your sale cost at the end of the day. Because when you tell client and say, I'm going to deliver this item to you, but you're going to pay $5 or $4 for logistic cost, it's always a very big problem. Some do not want to buy again or so. So if you are going to add the shipping cost to it, and it's going to increase the price of the product at the end of the day. And that affects you, because as a small business, you can't control your delivery. You can't say you want to create another delivery business. And possibly situations around here are not as advanced as some countries where you have a very good postal office system where delivery is less expensive compared to this part of the world. So what can we do in this time that we are trying to push things out? And yet, instead of technology helping you to save cost, it seems as if it's increasing the cost and it's affecting the interest of customers from buying your product. That would be my number one question. So what do you advise?
Hi, Victor. Firstly, wonderful. Thank you so much for your question. I think what I would say is that I'm a little bit surprised that your buyers would not pay for the delivery. At the end of the day, they're buying goods from you, right? And the cost of the good it takes into consideration the unit cost of producing that and any overheads you have associated with that. So I would say is that don't when you're selling this to somebody, don't tell them that the two are split, right? Just say that the cost of what I'm selling you is X, and make sure that the X includes the delivery cost with it, right? Don't sell it as a separate thing. That's the first principle, is because if you give that, it's very easy for your buyer to push the problem back onto you. So that's number one. Number two is that find a courier company or any logistic provider who can give you a good deal. If you say to them, right, I'm going to use you for 50 times in a month, right, and my usual package size is this, whatever goods you are doing, this is the weight, this is what's going to happen, I can deliver it to you, to your sort of collecting office, what is the best price you can give me, right? Because from their perspective, then there's a reoccurring business, right, that they would have on their side. So you're able to negotiate a better deal for doing that, right? I'll give you a good example, right? When I was, I use PayPal for receiving payment of a lot of goods I sell on eBay. So usually they were charging me first for about 4%, 4 to 5%. For taking the money that I was receiving for the sales I had made in eBay. I called them up and I told them, look, I'm a regular seller on eBay and you're taking 5% off from the sale I'm making. It's not profitable for me. I was able to negotiate it down to 2.9%, right? So what I'm saying to you, the message here is to say, if you can work with a courier company or logistic provider and negotiate a rate that works for you, package that in your price of goods sold and don't split it out is what I would say is sort of way of managing it on there. Another example is that if you always keep a slight margin in it. So if let's say something cost you $10 to make and $2 to sell, right, or $2 for the courier and logistics, sell it if possible for $13, right? Keep a little bit of a margin for yourself so that you can actually make some money out of it on there. So I think you need to start thinking about pricing your goods, bundling all the costs you have and not splitting it out like what you have, that would be my personal advice to you.
Thank you, Bhavna. I actually noticed a few other questions coming, but then I'm conscious of the time, and so I would suggest, if you don't mind, we can actually link, the questions, and then with you, and then people can follow up after this webinar. Is it okay with you, Bhavna?
I'm happy. Yes, I'm happy either way. I'm happy to take them now, or I can just reply to them separately as well, whatever you think is the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming to the end of the day, at least here in so
yeah.
yes.
Cool.
So we're gonna share your presentation and including the appendix that you mentioned with the resources, with the tools that can be helpful for our entrepreneurs after the webinar. But also there you go, already the link in the chat box. But also we're gonna upload the video on YouTube and share with you the link so that you can actually watch that afterwards. And then So thank you all for the for your attention and also the time to be part of this webinar. And then our next session will be on the 16th of June. With the topic on cash in, cash out, managing finances during crisis. So stay tuned for more webinars.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you, Bhavna. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. See you.
Thank you.
Ciao. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arpita.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.